In this module, we're going to be talking about the religion of Buddhism, and this is the second religion this semester that we've covered that originates from the eastern part of the world. It's not as widely practiced as Hinduism, but it is still a major religion. I think about 7% of the world population practices Buddhism today. So, in this lecture, we're going to first look at the life and teachings of the Buddha, and then we'll get into the way of life and the practices for those who claim to be Buddhist today. So, the religion of Buddhism is centered around one man who we will mostly refer to as the Buddha. But interestingly, we don't know much about him. While the Buddha does seem to be an actual historical figure, this can't be confirmed for sure, and many accounts of him are actually more legend than they are based on historical fact. So, throughout this lecture and what you read in your book, a lot of the teachings are based on the legends of the Buddha rather than on things that we know explicitly from history. So, looking at his early life, the Buddha is believed to have been born in the 6th century BCE, and he was born into a royal family. His father was a ruler of a small kingdom that was on the border of Nepal and India. And for whatever reason, his father wanted to protect him from all the pain that one experiences in normal life. So, Siddhartha Gautama, he grew up within the palace and was basically given whatever he wanted as a means of, staying away from pain and suffering. But he went on to marry a princess and have a son with her. But then, when he gets to the age 29, for the first time, he wants to venture out of the palace and experience the wider world. And it was on this trip, on this journey outside the palace, that he came across 4 things that we'll focus on, but 4 sights that he had that would change the course of his life forever. So the story goes that he is walking along and he has a companion with him that apparently has experienced the wider world, knows what it is to know suffering and to know the things that all people experience. So the first thing that he sees is a frail, really old man. And so the Buddha turns to his companion and, having never seen old age before, asks if this is normal. And the companion, of course, confirms that yes, everyone gets old. And then the second thing that he sees is a man that is afflicted with disease. And so once again, he asks the companion. The companion confirms that yes, disease and sickness are part of normal life. Third, he saw a corpse being carried off to be cremated. And he soon realizes that death is something that all humans experience. It's something that cannot be escaped. And then fourth, this one's a little bit different. He sees a man wandering around, homeless and without possessions. But somehow this man seemed to be content. And so this had a major impact on the Buddha. In fact, now getting into kind of what impact this had, it was so great that he left the palace. He didn't want to return to this normal life that he had grown accustomed to, where there was no pain, no suffering, so much protection from what life was really like. So instead of going back to the small kingdom, he kind of embraced this life of homelessness, of wandering around, searching for the truth about suffering. And he ended up finding other people that were like him that he could live with and that he could learn from. And to say that he was extreme in this lifestyle was, it's a bit of an understatement. He wore rags for clothing. He never cleaned himself. He barely even ate food. And it seems that as a result, he ended up basically losing his mind. But then one day, after this long period of this really crazy, harsh, extreme lifestyle, He was wandering through the forest and he discovered the principle of the middle way. And this was another moment in his life that would have a large effect on what was to come. So he actually overhears a music teacher teaching a student, and the teacher says that when the string on an instrument is too tight, it will break, but when it's too loose, it will not make any noise. And so the point was having this balance, that it needed to be a good in between. And as a result of that, as he ponders that principle, the Buddha decided that he needed to adopt this middle way, this healthy balance between the extreme lifestyle that he had and this lavish living, this way that he had been raised in the kingdom. So he set out to find that balance between those two. So, after kind of determining what this middle way was that he wanted to pursue, he traveled on to a village in northern India called Bodh Gaya. And it was there that he sat under a Bodhi tree and resolved to stay there, meditating, until he found the understanding that he wanted. So, until he arrived at the conclusions of what he should do with the rest of his life and kind of what was going on with all that he had determined in this last period of the harsh lifestyle, and then finding this principle of the middle way. So he ended up sitting here under this tree for 49 days. And it was then after this time that the accounts say enlightenment came. He reached this point of enlightenment. And in this period, he saw his past lives, something we'll get into if you remember from Hinduism, this idea of reincarnation. He was able to see into the past and see the past lives that he had lived and how karma had been at work. And he came to see that in order for this suffering that is part of human life, in order for that to end, then desire, just all human desire in general, must also come to an end. So the Buddha was not the first to reach enlightenment, but he is the one who gave the people the Dharma. If you remember, the Dharma from Hinduism was considered the law, the guidelines for living. And we'll talk more about exactly what the Buddha meant for the Dharma, but he is known as the Buddha. So he wasn't the first to reach enlightenment, but he is the Buddha, even though there have been other Buddhas. But in this experience under the tree, the Buddha experienced nirvana. And so he comes to this place of enlightenment and then reaches nirvana, which is the extinguishing of desire and suffering. And we'll get into more in a little bit what exactly that entails. So then we come to the point in the story where the religion of Buddhism is born. He went back to where he had practiced this harsh way of life, this extreme asceticism, and he found the 5 men that he had originally practiced that lifestyle with. And it was here in this place, Deer Park, that he taught his first sermon. And he directed it to these 5 men, and he told them about the middle way and some other core teachings, such as the 4 noble truths and the noble eightfold path. And we'll talk about what those are. But for the men that heard this sermon, they were the first followers of the Buddha. They were the first Buddhist monks, and they were the beginning of the Buddhist community, which is called the Sangha. So then from that time on, for the next several decades, he traveled throughout northern India, making converts as he went along. And he taught as many people as he could, and he ordained monks and nuns, and really devoted the whole rest of his life to kind of extending this mission and these teachings. But now we come to the death of the Buddha. And so 45 years after he reached this place of enlightenment and nirvana, the Buddha died at about 80 years old. He was on a journey, and he stopped to eat at the home of a blacksmith. And according to the legend, the meal was tainted with something, and he became fatally ill after eating whatever this food was. And so, as a result, the Buddha goes into a grove of trees and he lays down. And the monks that are with him gather all around him and they're just hoping to gain a little bit more wisdom from him. And so he tells them that the Dharma would always be their guide. He may not be there, but the Dharma would be with them. And so, with that, he went into a deep state of meditation and he died. And because he had gotten to this place of having no attachments to this world, he entered this state of peri-nirvana. And this means the complete and final entry into nirvana. He would not go through another reincarnation. He was done, so to speak. So that kind of captures the whole life of this founder of this religion, but now we need to see exactly what his teachings were that he was spreading. So you probably remember from studying Hinduism that the Dharma was the law, or one's duty, one's way they should live. It's similar in Buddhism, but it's also pretty distinct here in Buddhism. In its broader sense, the Dharma is kind of referring to all of nature and its laws. But in a more narrow sense, maybe more narrow to the Buddhist teaching, was that the Dharma was his own teachings that he passed down through the generations. So as he told the monks when he was dying, they wouldn't always have him, but they would have the Dharma. He was basically saying, you won't always have me, but you will have my teachings. So now getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of these teachings, there were a few key things that he held to. And first, there's the doctrine of interdependent origination. And this just states that nothing exists apart from anything else. And in a sense, we see this in daily life. For example, you were brought into existence through a man and woman coming together. You didn't just pop into existence all on your own out of nowhere. But the Buddha took it a step further. He claimed that there were that there was a cycle of 12 causal factors that could bring something into existence when one of these factors was set into motion. And so, it goes beyond just kind of the general pattern that we see in daily life, but rather he had these very specific things that when this thing occurred, something was basically popped into existence. So the three marks of existence are impermanence, suffering, and no self. So first, impermanence is the idea that all things are always changing, always in this state of becoming. Suffering comes from the desire to hold on to things when in reality, because they are always changing, nothing can actually be held on to. So humans naturally have this desire for things to remain the same, but given this idea of impermanence, that's not exactly possible. And I think according to the Buddha, suffering took on many forms. Suffering was, to want was to suffer, to lack something was to suffer. Anger, hatred, loneliness, grief, all of these negative emotions or negative experiences were all considered suffering by the Buddha. And then finally, the doctrine of no self. Of all the things that humans desire, it seems the most basic or the greatest attachment we have is to our notion of ourself. But he wanted to teach that the self is not concrete or static. The self is always changing and it's always dependent on other things. And we'll get into how this plays into the idea of reincarnation in a minute. And that's where I think this gets really interesting, this doctrine of no self. So then talking about another one of his essential teachings, this was the Four Noble Truths. And this was one of the teachings that the Buddha gave in his first sermon at Deer Park. This fundamental teaching actually follows the 4 steps that ancient Indian doctors followed that were used to diagnose and treat illnesses. So these noble truths were meant to empower a person to recognize their suffering and be able to heal themselves. And so the four truths are that suffering is just a part of life. The cause of suffering is desire, and there's no way to put an end to desire and suffering. So then the way forward, the way to navigate this idea of suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path. So we're not going to get into detail of what every part of this Eightfold Path is, but it is helpful to see the 8 aspects that can be divided into 3 divisions, and each of these divisions have their own goal. So first is the wisdom division, and this comes from having the right view and the right intention. And this is has the goal of ensuring that a person understands Buddhist teachings and is committed to them. The second division is about cultivating ethical conduct, so that includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The idea is that ethical conduct leads to mental clarity. And then finally, the last one is concentration division, and it's focused on right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And we'll get to this in a bit, but I guess the end goal of Buddhism is to get to this place of perfect concentration, of perfect awareness. And so he's basically saying that this perfect awareness first comes from understanding and knowledge, and then good conduct, and then the actual mindfulness and concentration and awareness itself. Now getting into the ideas of rebirth and karma, you'll see, and you should have already seen this in the textbook, that while this is similar to the same ideas of rebirth and incarnation in Hinduism, it's actually also different in Buddhism. Whereas Hindus believe that there is an eternal, unchanging soul that doesn't change from life to life in each reincarnation, this is not the case in Buddhism. The soul does change, per Buddhism, from one incarnation to the next. So there's still a connection from one life to the next, but it's not an unchanging soul. Really, this is where things get kind of weird. The Buddhist teaching on this is even pretty obscure and debated amongst people. But it does seem to be the case that something stays the same from one incarnation to the next, but it's not something that we can easily point to and nail down, such as with Hinduism, we can say the soul remains the same. With Buddhism, it's a little more obscure. One example that's given to describe this is the concept of using one candle to light another candle. The only thing that remains the same between these is that energy is passed from one candle to the next, but that's it. So maybe that can be kind of a helpful example for this idea of how there's some kind of connection between this cycle of birth and rebirth. Then coming to the idea of nirvana, this is the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. It is the liberation from suffering. It is this idea of enlightenment, of blowing out of desire and suffering. And this is another interesting part. Nirvana is actually something that can't be described. According to the Buddha, it must be experienced. So any attempt to describe it will always come up short if it has to be an experiential knowledge. But just as an attempt to describe it, it is said to bring about perfect bliss. Now, there's quite a bit of diversity when it comes to belief about gods in Buddhism. Some are basically atheists that believe that there is no God. It's all about just the Buddha, but he was a human. He's not recognized as a deity. While other Buddhists believe in many gods. Interestingly, the Buddha didn't say much about gods, but he did discourage devotion to them. He wanted his followers to only be devoted on him and the Dharma, his teachings. So now we come to more of the practices. We've looked at who the Buddha was and some of his key teachings, and so now we need to see how this plays out and what these practices are. So, in order to be considered Buddhist, a person must cite what's known as the three refuges as a way of affirming their Buddhist identity. And this comes from the first monks of Buddha, that they also made these statements to show their commitment. And the three refuges are: I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. And remember, that's referring to the Buddhist community. And this is the closest thing that Buddhists have to a religious creed. So then you have that a person, if they're going to become a Buddhist, they need to recite these three sentences as a way of showing their commitment. And then they also need to show their commitment by committing to follow the 5 precepts. And these are basically just ethical commands that, once again, when the ethical way of living is established, they should hopefully help lead a person to nirvana. And so some of these commands include do not kill, do not steal, do not lie, and a couple of more. Now coming to the practice of meditation, this is a very major part of life as a Buddhist. If you think about the life of the Buddha, meditation was very important to him. Just thinking to that 49 days that he spent in this state of meditation. So it's so much so encouraged that people say you can't fully understand the Buddha's teachings without meditation. But interestingly today, most Buddhists don't have the time to properly meditate, when these people are just engaged in the normal ways of society, having a family, having a job, all of that. So instead of taking the time to properly meditate, they instead support monastic communities, the ones that are monks and nuns that do devote their entire lives to meditation. So kind of the normal life Buddhist, they support these monastic communities, they support Buddhist causes, and they try to live by Buddhist principles in hopes that this will gain merit with them and that they can have a more favorable rebirth. So now let's look at different kinds of meditation that Buddhists do. And you can see those first two. I'm going to try not to butcher the way these are said. So shamatha is a meditation that seeks to focus awareness on a single object of concentration. And the goal of this is to stabilize the mind. The second one is vipassana, and this is mindfulness meditation. It is supposed to clear out thoughts, feelings, daydreams, all of these things that can kind of consume us, and is supposed to allow a person to just be, to be in a state of awareness without distraction. Another type of meditation is walking meditation, and the goal of it is just to help one be mindful and content with what they're doing. They're not trying to get somewhere, they're just focused on the act of walking. Next is visualization, which is the mental contemplation of the body of the Buddha. Visualization tends to be important in a lot of these practices. The next one is deity yoga, and this is a practice with the belief that the mind comes to embody the deity that is invoked through a visualization. So you have kind of the mind and the body working together to embody the deity. And then finally you have mandalas, and the practice of visualizing these are circular diagrams that map out how a Buddhist deity manifests itself in and as the universe. And these are often very artistic. I think we actually have a picture of one. Yeah, so here's an example. This looks very similar to what we saw as a practice of Hinduism, but this is actually also part of Buddhism and part of the meditation practices. So then, like we've seen in the other two religions that we've covered so far, there are also sacred places that Buddhists try to go visit as well. There are also relics of the Buddha that people come to see, and some of these are buried in stupas, which are basically just large burial structures. And then finally, wrapping up, there are two major festivals for Buddhists, and these are the Vesak and the Asala festivals. The first celebrates the birth and the death of the Buddha, while the second celebrates when the Buddha gave his first teaching.